I was just going to say, although this book is focused on young people first, I talked with a number of my colleagues. I mean, I came at this originally from having been an educator myself, although not in the K-12 system, right? So coaching high schoolers on their academics and other things surrounding their academic lives, but teaching more at the college level. But still, at the college that I was teaching at, there were so many, they were increasingly stepping up. This was down in Florida, where even then, a number of years ago, before the current governor, they were just increasing rules, regulations, all the restrictions around what you're allowed to teach, what you're not allowed to teach, exactly what you're allowed to do, say, et cetera. That was emulating more and more what my friends in the K-12 space, educators in the K-12 space, were encountering. And if I do a follow-up on this book, it will be can you help me give a SH blank T for educators, right? Because none of all the things that we sort of talk about in the book around student motivation are also things that most educators don't get. Most educators do not have sufficient meaningful choices that they can make because of the amount of rules and strictures that are kind of pushing them down. They don't get the chance to have real belonging in that environment. It's not something that's particularly focused on, right? And then they're regularly given new things, thus completely depriving them of their sense of ability, right? It's like, no, now you follow this curriculum. 2 years later, actually, now it's this one. Here's a completely new one. Here's a whole new set of PD. Now do this instead, right? Oh, no, now do this instead, right? So it's like a constant shifting landscape where you don't get the chance to build those basic foundations of sustainable motivation as an educator either. So I really listen to the student stories with a lot of empathy for the students, but also with a lot of empathy for the educators who are trying usually. I mean, they're like in all jobs, right? There are some people that shouldn't be doing the job, but every educator I've ever known is trying very hard, the best they can, and not set up for success in much the same way that the students are, for exactly some of the reasons you're describing, right? Like middle school, I think, is even harder than high school to have motivation because you have that beginning of that adolescent development. I want to be independent. I want to start to adult. I've got all these crazy things happening with my hormones. Grades don't really matter yet. That's not where I'm focused, but now I want to have more agency, but I can't have more, it's like, it's such a mess. My middle schooler asked me, he's like, can we work together on now doing a book where you talk with middle schoolers about all their experiences? And I was like, I don't know that I can tackle middle school. It's hard. It's a hard area.
It is. Yes. It was a tough one to teach too. So you talk a little in the book. I think you mostly focus on public school, but you touch a little bit on private and homeschooling as well. Maybe just talk about the differences quickly before we get into it.
Yes, I will try to be more succinct. Not my strong suit.
It's okay.
But so, yeah, I talked mostly with students in public education because that's where I think the majority of parents and educators are struggling the most with what to do because there's more constraints around how you do public education than around how you do private or homeschooling. That's really the main difference that I see between those different setups, right? Is that public is the default. That is what our property taxes or other state taxes, federal taxes are going to pay for. It's with the idea that we think that it is a social good to, have education provided to everybody. And that's the sort of default then that people kick into and suddenly realize they're struggling with, right? And when you're in the middle of a very slow moving system that you suddenly realize you're struggling with, would systemic change help? Yes, but in the meantime, you need supports for dealing with the way that things are in your exact environment as it is right then, not just ideas about, how to do longer term change that might benefit the next round of students, a decade or 5 years later down the line. So that to me is the biggest difference. I think it's easier to pivot in homeschooling, in private school. You can pivot much more quickly than you can in public school.
Right. That's what I was thinking too, so I've done everything. I've taught in private, public, and homeschooling, and I've done private, public, and homeschooling. And then for a while, I also taught on a marketplace type platform called OutSchool, where most of my students were homeschoolers and the parents would outsource on a few classes. I loved it because you could really hone in on something. You didn't have the state standards. When we get to the part about history, I wanted to say some things from the teacher perspective. But the good thing about homeschooling, a lot of people, a subculture of homeschooling is unschooling, where you let the kid kind of direct their interests. is that you can do that a lot more. And in private school, a little bit. Actually, when I was teaching in a private school, I also had my own kid going to public school, so I was able to compare. And one advantage of the public school, at least compared to the private school I went to, is they do offer a lot more variety and choices of classes. And also, there was one point in your book where you're talking about being able to go ahead or go behind. The private school only allowed you to go one grade up or one grade down in, let's say, math. And you use math as an example. So my son, so good at math, excelled at math. He was able to do Algebra 1 in 7th grade. I don't think he would have been able to do that in the private school. And then obviously in homeschooling, you can go at your own kid's pace.
Right.
So I do think advantages and disadvantages, but with the public school, you have set criteria of things you need to get through in the whole year. Like you need to get through all of this. So sometimes you don't have time to go deep, especially when I was doing history in high school. You have to go from the Revolutionary War all the way to present day. And as time keeps going, more and more history keeps happening.
Yeah.
And it was so hard to get through all of that. But we'll talk a little more about that when we get to it. So you also talk a little bit about the difference between high school and college. Talk a little about that. And I'm going to share part of the book while you're talking a little bit.
Yeah. And there's a few places where I talk about that. Is there a particular one that you think is most interesting to talk about? Or I guess you're pulling that up.
So I'm sharing here, but I have it on, I read it on my phone, but you can't, on StreamYard, you can't share to your phone. But it was, okay. Oh, the girl, the Grace, who was an activist. So see, I would actually expect this to be the opposite. Most people are more activists when they get to college.
Right.
But she was able to be an activist in high school, but then she went to college and wasn't able to do that anymore. Her college was really prestigious.
So Grace is my co-author. So we have hers in third person because she started off as my interviewee, and then as we were working, she was the first interviewee, and as I uncovered her interest in journalism and in activism and in community support, I said, do you want to work together on this to really make sure that young people's voices are represented really throughout the text, not just by me, interviewing and then interpreting it. So her stories are still told in the third person because she started off as an interviewee and then also was involved in the overall writing and revision of the book. So in her case, where she went to high school, she was very surprised to realize that her high school actually gave her more freedom and choice and meaningful opportunities to get involved in the issues and topics that she cared about. She was actually able to do some very cool progressive programs where students were able to get involved with teachers in developing professional development for teachers, things like that she was really jazzed about and felt was really meaningful to her. And when she got to Penn, she thinks Penn is great, wonderful, prestigious, but she was not prepared for how much the sort of prestige of the university, especially in that first year there, sort of takes over everything, right? So that all she was doing was focused on the courses that were mostly required and locked in by virtue of the major and minor that she had selected. And she just didn't feel like she had the connections, didn't feel like she had the freedom, didn't feel like she had this sort of like community oriented support. The main things that she noticed there was how much students seem to feel the need to like perform that they already know everything. And they don't, that like they're sort of perform excellence all the time, rather than her high school environment where she found it was very academically challenging in the IB program she was in, but with the expectation like this is hard and therefore we support each other, right? And so a lot of it was the culture change that she did not expect, because she thought, oh, college is going to be great. That's where I'm going to have more choices. That's where I'm going to be able to work towards the things that I'm really committed to and interested in. And that was what she was particularly surprised by, was how in her case that wasn't her experience of her first year, especially.
Okay, yeah, and that is the opposite, but I mean, everyone's experience is different, but what you would expect or what other people have said, usually people say, oh, in college, I got to get more courses in my major. I was able to do a lot more advocacy. So it's just interesting that it was the opposite for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think she ascribed a lot of that to like for exactly that reason. She was expecting the reverse. And she ascribed to, oh, I went to the most prestigious university that I was able to get into and chose that path. And the high school that I was at was not like a, top compete. It wasn't operating with the kind of culture of like, we're a highly competitive institution. And so the change in culture, I think, led to a reverse of what I think is common in a lot of places, where if you're coming from a high school that is really structured, feels more competitive, is sort of considering itself, which is often the path that students who then get into those prestigious universities are following. Well, compared with their high school, the university is a more open and diverse environment where there's a range of clubs or range of activities or things like that to get involved in. So it sounds to me like she was more attributing it to how unusual her high school was, and that she did not realize how unusual her high school was until she got to university and saw how different it felt.
Right. And you said she was also in the IB program, and sounds like she had a positive experience, because I have heard some negatives about that, but obviously it depends. It's going to depend where you are and your personality. Yeah. From what I've heard from our school system is it's so rigorous that kids can't do sports or have after school jobs. It's just, but they end up doing better in college because they've already had to manage that level. Time.
Yeah. I've heard the same things too, that real mixed bag about whether or not IB is the right fit. I think in Grace's case, lockdown happened to coincide really well with where there was the highest level of intensity, because she was then able to have schedule flexibility by virtue of doing it from home and still incorporate in, like it's talked about in the book, some movement breaks and make sure she was getting enough sleep and things like that. But that was afforded very temporarily because of the response to the pandemic, right? Like that would not, I imagine, even in her high school now, still be the same way. The IB program might not be so good of a fit if she'd not had that time period where she'd had a lot more flexibility because of the response to the pandemic.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about building relationships with the students, because that seemed to be a theme of a lot of the students in the book. So when I taught middle school, and it might be different with middle schoolers, but I went to a rough middle school. I started in the middle of the year. I had a rough start with some students. So then there was two of the students that were particularly rough were upset one day. I let them eat lunch with me, which then they started coming every day. And I think it blurred the lines a little bit between what was supposed to be, an authority-child relationship. And I saw the downsides. So how can us teachers have a balance of, we want to have a good relationship with the students, but not too chummy where it's detrimental?
Yeah. Or where it can end up taking over all of your time and your life, right? Some of the stories that students share with me, the inner educator in me was like, I wouldn't do what it is that you're describing this educator that you really love did, because it sounds like they're spending 90, 100 hours a week. They're making themselves available, at off hours to be both an emotional support and an academic support, right? Like, some of the things that they were describing were things that I personally could not do as an educator, and couldn't in good conscience, like, just recommend and be like, this is a great idea. Definitely do that. Work yourself to the bone and make yourself totally available all the time. Right. So there's that balance between, because my overall intent with the book was wanting to make sure to put students' voices at the center, and have that really be what's guiding, so that people can think and respond and hopefully prompt, engage in conversations with the young people in their lives, whether it's their kids or their students, to really talk and think about what would work in their environment and why, collaboratively. I didn't want to come in and be like, well, here's my interpretation of whether or not this, that, like my personal interpretation as an educator, whether or not this would be a good idea for other educators within the book itself. That said, I think you're right that one has to be cautious. I certainly experienced that even at the college level, right? Where some students it worked very well with, and some students turned out that they had mental health issues that I didn't know about, and them becoming like overly connected to me created some very dicey situations down the road, right? And so it's certainly not just as simple as like become BFFs with all of your students.
Yeah.
One of the examples that I love the most, though, was shared by one of the students, and I don't know if you'll remember this one. I believe it was, now, because I gave everybody a pseudonym, but I know their real names, I sometimes slip. So I'm not going to try to say the name because I cannot remember which one is pseudonym and which one is real name right now off the top of my head in a live presentation. But one of the students whose name starts with A was talking about how his particular teacher that he really admired and appreciated wasn't buddy with the students. It wasn't like he knew all of their lives and all the details and was friends with them, but he was very personable in the way that he provided his academic support, right? And so what that looked like in his classroom was, I'm creating work time. There were activities. I think some of these activities didn't make it into the book, but he was describing how he would do activities where he would like stage things around the room. So the students were getting up and moving around the room, and like, you know, as they solved different things, they got to get little pieces of candy or, you know, little things like that, which even at the high school, I was like, really, candy? He's like, oh yeah, no, everybody would do all kinds of stuff for candy. He's like, and he would have like work time where we were working on stuff, and if we were confused, we'd raise our hand and he would come over and just give you all of his attention. It was very clear that he was interested in helping you succeed. But unlike some of the other stories that were shared by students, he didn't know anything about their personal lives. He wasn't sort of like buddy when they weren't like hanging out at lunch or after school or something like that. You know, just like coming over and hanging out in his classroom. And I found myself wondering again, you know, as an educator, like, I wonder if that is a good balance to strike that this young person is describing, of like making it very clear that he's very invested in their success and there for them if they have a question about the academic material, but not going so far as like becoming, you know, sort of friends with the students. That said, it was way more common that the students that, you know, the teachers the students talked about being most engaged with were ones that they felt like were not like a friend like their peers, but like a trusted adult who they felt comfortable going to for advice about things in their life as well as in their academics. And I think that's such a tricky balance because obviously the ideal is that's the school counselor. And yet what some of the students were talking about is like, the school counselor doesn't know me. Their schedule is crazy busy. I can't just show up and randomly form a relationship with them in anticipation of when I might eventually want to ask for advice. Like, I really appreciated when I could ask teachers who knew me and who I had a relationship with and who I respected and who I knew like cared about me as an overall human being, when I could ask them for advice about how to deal with tricky situations with my friends or, you know, things that were happening like at the school, but not as part of the classroom. So I wish I had a nice answer. But I think it's really hard. And the only idea that it would give me would be like, okay, we need to engage in a discussion with this, like as a class, right? Like let's have a collaborative discussion about what's the level of rapport that's going to help you succeed that you all need, so that it could be kind of built together and maybe be some classroom norms set around the level of closeness and support.
You forget that not everybody knows like you. Like the English teacher thinks everyone loves reading as much as her, and 100 pages is nothing. Or so when I was teaching at OutSchool with mostly homeschoolers, I actually taught civics, and I grew up with my parents always watching the news, always talking about politics. So I mean, I knew what a Democrat was when I was 5. So I was expecting them to come with background knowledge that I started to realize that they didn't all have, you know, or I'd be surprised. Like, you don't know that, or you've never heard of that, or that's going on in the news right now. You didn't know. And people would say to me, well, did you watch the news when you were in 9th grade? Well, actually I did. So you forget that they're not, you know, with you. Or like me, I'm not as good at science. And for some people it comes natural. And that science teacher was always interested in it. And you should just be able to get it after I explain it. So I thought that was interesting too, that all of us teachers need to just remember that not every student is going to have the background knowledge. If it's not elective, they didn't choose the class, they have to take it.
Right.
And even in college, you have your core classes you have to take before you get into your major. So let's talk about that a little bit. You gave several examples in the book.
Yeah, it was one of the things that as students started talking about those experiences with teachers, I definitely had a like, oh yeah, I can relate to this because what I taught at the college level mostly was the required introductory writing course, right? I taught other higher level writing courses that students opted into, but most of the time it was the introductory writing course that all students were shunted into, generally didn't want to be there, generally didn't think of themselves as writers, weren't interested in thinking of themselves as writers, were convinced the career they were going into was not going to require them to write at all. Right. And I, meanwhile, according to my mom, my first complete sentence out of my mouth when I was like 2 was, "Mom, I'm going to be a writer when I grow up." Right. So you couldn't have much more disparity. And as students were telling some of the stories, I was like, yep, I can relate to, I absolutely know as a professor that I made that mistake at times. The things that just seemed perfectly obvious to me were not obvious to my students. And that was why I was so grateful to a particular advisor that I had when I was earning my PhD, who came from a family of engineers and had gone into English and writing simply because as a woman at that time, engineering did not seem culturally normal, acceptable, et cetera, to her. It was like, well, if you're going to be an educator, you go into English. But she really had much more of an engineer's brain, and she dissected and attacked the instruction of writing with that almost more quantitative basis of like, we're going to break down the rules, we're going to make this all explicit. And her whole way of approaching it really caused me to notice how much implicit knowledge there was that I had never consciously acquired it. It had just been there. And as students would share those stories in the interviews, I was like, this doesn't just apply to writing, this applies across the board. These are obvious in the stories that students are sharing. It's really hard when you love something and you're strong at it to be good at helping people learn it who don't love it and aren't strong at it, right? I think it requires a real mindset shift where you're describing with science, right? I think it's a similar trick that I used to use to kind of like get myself in the right mindset is, okay, what am I not noticing that if I was in a math class, math was not my strong suit, right? Where like, how can I engage with this piece about writing the way that I would want someone to engage with me about math, right? There's like something to like switch my brain into noticing what tacit assumptions I have. And that's the other piece where the engaging meaningfully and collaborating with students can do so much, because if they trust that you actually want to collaborate with them to have the class be more meaningful, right? If that rapport is there and that trust is there, then you don't have to do as much work inside your head trying to figure out, well, what is it that's actually going to make sense to them? And what is it that, like, where are they really starting from? And what things can I safely assume as their baseline level of, mindsets and knowledge and not? Because you can do it with them, right? Like you can learn from them and then add to that knowledge when it's like all on us as educators to figure it all out, where they are and what's going to be the best way to reach them, and then do it and then get them to where they need to be. And they're just kind of passive vehicles. In my experience, that never worked. Not once did I feel like that a student actually got where they needed to be by the end of the semester.
Right. And with math, so I've taught kind of math at the lower levels, or I was a para where I was supposed to help them catch up in math when they were behind, or I've tutored in math at the lower level. And I feel like that is something where people either have a math mind where they just get it, or other people just, it comes hard to them. And you have to try different ways of explaining. And so that is one where it's pretty black or white. People either get it or they don't. You had some examples that were off, where there were teachers that were purposely mean or bullying to kids, which is unfortunate. Yeah. I mean, I think in teaching, most teachers are good people who are in it because they love kids, but the day-to-day it's easy to get frustrated with kids. We might have like a bad day or something, but the couple of examples you gave, it looked like the people were purposely being mean, which is unfortunate. Because maybe they have the power and they know they have power over kids and they took advantage. And I know that can be in any profession where the manager or even cops. I have a lot of respect for cops, but obviously there's some bad ones too, or bad bosses. So I'm going to find the examples you gave, but talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, any situation where there's a power disparity, it then becomes that much more of an issue if it happens to be that the person with more of the power, let's just say, has some unresolved issues, right? Like, and should not at that point in their life probably have power over other people until they get those issues resolved, right? So I think you're spot on. It applies across professions. It just becomes more and more of an issue when someone's in a situation they can't readily get out of, right? So I've had managers who had unresolved issues, and I quit those jobs, right? Like, I was able to be like, this is not a psychologically healthy place for me to work. This person is clearly abusive. I am quitting this job. I am leaving. I'm going to find another job and not stay in this situation. For students, that's obviously, they can't just be like, I quit this class. I mean, in college, they can do that. But at the middle and high school level, they can't just be like, I quit this class, unless they're going to become like a full-fledged dropout or take a much more dramatic step. And so the risks there are much greater. And to me, the reason that I included those stories is, one, because students shared them, and I wanted to make sure that the range of their experiences were represented. But two, because I hope that having some empathy and recognizing that sometime, probably somewhere along their K-12 trajectory, a good percentage of students are going to unfortunately encounter a teacher who is not just frustrated and burned out, like I have certainly been, right? And like most educators can relate to being, but actually abusive, right? Actually verbally abusive in some way. And it's very hard to recover from that. And so it helps me when I'm working with young people and they seem particularly recalcitrant or particularly hesitant to engage in any of the more creative or risk-taking, intellectual risk-taking activities of a class, to pause and think, okay, what if somewhere along the line, this student had a teacher where they were humiliated every time they took a risk and volunteered something in class? What if that happened to them, right? Might that cause me to respond differently without needing to know for sure that it definitely did? Can I just assume that probably for a good percentage of my students that has happened somewhere along their trajectory? And therefore, can that give me a little bit more empathy for still finding something to appreciate about them as a person, even if they're not a particularly strong student in my class, coming from that place of empathy. And so that was why it was particularly important to me to include the stories, because they're not that long, but they are, to me, at least heart-wrenching, right? So like, imagine being in that situation and you're stuck there for 9 months with someone who is basically being verbally abusive to you or your classmates almost every single day, right?
Right. And I mean, you can do things like try to advocate for your kid to get out of there, but it's not always easy. They give you a lot of pushback for.
Yeah.
He said something like, they said we need to go get ready for prom because a lot of people skipped that day because prom was that night.
Yeah. She was saying, like, he said the next day was a day that typically a lot of the seniors skipped because it was the day of, like, prom was in the evening, and so they would skip to get ready. And he said to them something like, how many of you will still be here tomorrow because you're too ugly to go to prom? Right? Or something like that. It was like, because you're not popular enough to go to prom. Something that was basically like making fun of them if they were going to come to school the next day and be in his class the next day.
And I mean, I think it's good that you kept the stories in there because, like, it needs to be known that there are awful people doing these types of things out there, taking advantage of kids and being abusive. So I also wanted to talk about bullying from other kids. You had one story in there, and how that affected him academically.
Yeah. Are you talking about, because there were a few examples, but Tuesdays was obviously the most significant bullying story. Is that the one that you're thinking of?
Right. It was this one here. They were in the parking lot and they ended up getting in an altercation.
Yep. Yeah.
And the thing, I hate when schools do this, and a lot of schools do this, but usually both people get in trouble. And I feel like if one person is clearly the aggressor and the other person either shouldn't get punished or have a lesser punishment for defending themselves. And when I was in middle school, I had a fight in my class. And the problem is it's always he said, she said, he started it. No, he did. So sometimes you truly don't know as a teacher.
Yeah.
I mean, but if you have proof, especially this kid had been harassing him before and he told administration, so they already had a paper trail that he had been bothered by this student. If it's like clear that one person's the aggressor over the other, then I don't think someone should get punished for defending themselves, because even in a court of law, they give leniency or even acquittal if it is a self-defense situation.
Yeah.
So I thought, so then he felt like, well, I've tried telling teachers and no one does anything. And then I try to defend myself and I get suspended.
Right. Yeah. I think it did feel especially frustrating to him, as like, you know, okay, I've been repeatedly picked on for identity related reasons, both in the fairly small community that he lived in. It was both not acceptable that he was trans female to male. It was not acceptable that he was biracial, white and Asian. And it wasn't acceptable that, I think as he put it, he had a like larger body size. This is the same student that was mocked and called panda by students at other points in his school experience. So repeatedly picked on across all three of those different markers. And he had tried to do the thing of like reporting when he was being harassed and bullied and picked on, and then nothing would happen. And then we report and then nothing would happen. And so it's like, you know, by this point in my, you know, I believe it was his senior year, it's just like, okay, so obviously it's on me to defend myself. And so, you know, someone started picking on him and harassing him and then saying, you know, well, if you weren't a girl, I'd hit you. And he was like, no, I'm not. So fine. If that's your reason, then you go right ahead. Right. Let's engage in this fight. And so as in that conversation with Tuesday, I think what was particularly striking was that he's actually very like calm, soft-spoken, and was like, you know, it wasn't that it bothered him that he was suspended. It bothered him that the other student, in addition to being suspended, was not given any sort of essentially like consequence or training to have them direct away from bigotry and hatred, right? That like, okay, fine, I'm in trouble because it's a no tolerance policy and I engaged in this physical altercation too. But I didn't engage in hateful language towards that kid based on his identity. He did that towards me, right? He was saying LGBTQ slurs and he was saying racial slurs, and he was using a whole range of slurs against me. And why was that not in any way given any kind of like additional, you know, consequence, whether it was a longer suspension or whether it was some kind of training, you know, anti-bigotry training or something. There was, you know, the message that clearly sent to Tuesday was the school does not care about the level of hatred that I am facing from my peers every single day. They clearly don't care. They didn't care when I reported it, and they didn't care when this altercation happened. They don't care all the way up and down the line. The only thing I need to do is try to figure out how to get out of here as fast as humanly possible. And I just thought that was really, like, that's awful. That's not how are you going to learn when that's the type of learning environment that you're facing?
Right. And unfortunately, more and more parents and teachers are now starting to just go to the law because if the school doesn't do anything, because it makes no sense if he goes outside of the confines of school. I don't know why school always gets more protected. He goes and says that to someone on the street. Yeah, he might get punched in the face. And so, I mean, that also, there's going to be real world consequences that he's not learning at the stage that he's in school, high school. So I wanted to talk about history because you give a lot of like, well, the kids aren't really learning, you know, or going as in depth. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but in our defense, history teachers, we have a lot to go through in a year. And with so much to go through, you can only kind of touch on it. Also, with teaching, well, I was in middle school, but this applies to high school too. College totally different because now we're talking technically adults, even though they're not really adults yet. That you can't. I mean, parents would get mad, teachers get mad. Real history is not pretty. Real history is pretty gory, pretty terrible. And I remember when I was a kid, I actually hated history because it is just a bunch of like facts that you're learning, and this happened and this happened. And it wasn't until I was an adult and really got to dive into different stories, like, oh, this is interesting and this is awful, and how come I never learned this? So I always said, oh, if I become a history teacher, I'm going to teach it so differently. Well, that is just like saying, before you became a parent and you're like, well, when I become a parent, they're never going to be on their iPad and they're never
right.
Yeah,
I feel we're all better parents before we have our kids. Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Right. The best parents have no kids.
Yep.
So I feel like it's that way with history. You like in a public school setting with a massive amount of kids with a lot to get through, with constraints of you can't teach them the too gory stuff.
Yep.
You can't dive too deep because you got to get through all of this stuff in a year. You really just can't. So that's where I think homeschooling is a little bit better, because you can dive into, you could read novels and, maybe nonfiction books about people's lives. And when I taught for OutSchool, I had upper elementary, sort of sometimes middle schoolers. I would push the envelope, never cross of what I should do, but I'd push the envelope a little bit because it was homeschoolers and I could. When we talked about civil rights, I would show footage of the bridge in Selma, and the kids were shocked. Like, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe policemen did this. I can't believe this actually happened. And they can't believe that some of the people from that area are still alive. So that's my defense in your book, because the book talked a lot about like, oh, we didn't learn this in school. We didn't learn, we didn't learn all of these things. You really can't. That's just my defense as a teacher.
No. And I listen, I totally understand. And I hope that the book does not come across as attacking teachers, because I know that was not the intent of the students. The Aria's story is the particular one where this comes out the most strongly, and a little bit in King's stories as well, but especially Aria gives like a very detailed accounting on this. And I really viewed what she was sharing as an indictment of the rules and regulations that constrain what teachers are allowed to teach, far more than a criticism of any of her specific teachers. And I thought that she did such an amazing job articulating the damage that does when certain topics are discussed and certain topics aren't touched on. Right. Now, she did give one example of a teacher literally giving factually incorrect information about the murder of Fred Hampton, I believe it was. But I could see that being something where like the teacher just made a mistake, right? Not like they were trying to intentionally whitewash something. But overall, it's mostly because and this is where like the culture wars have made education harder. And this was something that Aria was talking about. She was talking about how there were things that some of her middle school teachers covered in more depth when they read The True Story of Emmett Till, and how that English teacher in 8th grade, she's like, it was a very uncomfortable conversation. And this teacher led us through a very uncomfortable conversation about something that really happened and shouldn't have happened. And we had a range of races sitting in the classroom having this very uncomfortable conversation. She's like, I could not imagine, she was a senior when we were talking to her, and now is, in college. She's like, I couldn't imagine that conversation happening now with all of this like culture war conversation about education, because at that point it was before that had sort of hit the sort of state level and national news and mindset. And she's like, now I don't even know how a teacher, she was kind of going off script a little bit for us to be able to have that conversation in English class in relation to reading the book, not in history class. And I think that'd be really hard for a teacher to do now. So that was something that she was particularly calling out. And the reason I particularly wanted to keep that story in is that I thought, we have gotten so caught up in the political conversation around the culture wars and parents' rights and, who gets to dictate, who gets to say what. I have a lot of friends who are K-12 educators in Florida and who are now very restrained in what they're allowed to say and speak in the classroom because of the, laws passed down there, right? We get caught up in like all that level. And I think it's really easy to forget about what's the actual student experience like being caught in the after effects of this. And I thought that the way that Aria articulated that was so powerful and painful, of like, that the effect for her, the impact for her was not that she was mad at the teacher, was not that she felt like the teacher was making certain decisions, but it was just like, how am I supposed to trust the curriculum when what's happening, when I'm having to supplement it via my friend that has extra time because I'm high achieving and I've got everything booked, all day, every day, and I can't go and supplement it. But he's decided to not be a high achieving student. So he's going and supplementing his education by deliberately reading a lot more history than what's being covered. And then he's informing me about the things that are getting skipped. And now I'm going, well, then I can't trust this content because it seems pretty convenient, the things that are getting skipped versus the things that are getting talked about. Somebody clearly made a decision somewhere along the line about which of the things were going to get included and which of the things were going to get skipped. And now I don't have trust in this whole thing because I feel like I need to second guess all of it, right? And that's the effect. And I just thought that's a perspective that's not, I don't usually hear talked about when we engage in the conversations about, the sort of political debate culturally as adults about what belongs in the classroom and what doesn't belong in the classroom. And, teachers shouldn't be bringing their ideology into the classroom. And the point that she was making is very simple. Like, this is not about anybody's ideology being brought into the classroom. It's just literally about which stories from history are being shared and which stories are not being shared. And the choices seemed pretty deliberate to her in terms of their effect. I just thought that was really powerful, the way that she was talking about it.
Right. And I wasn't at all saying you shouldn't have not included in the book, but I was just trying to give a teacher's perspective. But it is actually hard to talk about politics in the class. I remember being a kid and I used to love when we talk about current events or, when you could, who's on this side, when presidents were running, and you can't even do that. So I worked at a Christian school, only had 9 students in my class, and we got in a conversation about politics. I ended up having a kid stand up, scream, and leave. And this happened maybe twice where I was like, I just can't talk about it's just not a good idea to talk about politics in the class. So it's unfortunate that we can't have civil conversations. And then you brought up, there was one point where either you said it or you were quoting someone who said, we need to learn about history because we're going to be voting. So very good point, because history does have to do with present day or, studying history. I mean, look at communism. It's never worked ever once, ever in history if you study it. But, there's still people who are talking about it. So, I mean, that was really interesting as well. And another thing, you were talking about English and history. So when I was in high school, it was my junior year, I had a combined history and social studies class. They decided to combine it because I do think they actually go together a little bit, because if you start reading books and stories, that's English, but you can read books and stories about history. So also when I was teaching 6th grade, in the 6th grade English class, they read a book about the Depression. So that knowing that they had that background knowledge actually helped us to be able to teach it and go through it fast and helped the students have knowledge. But I do think that reading novels and books is the best way to learn history, because it's more just reading stories instead of boring facts like this happened, that happened. Also one point I wanted to make too is that parents can also supplement. When you were talking about, how come they didn't know more about this subject or that subject? We're constrained as teachers to not show anything too gory. But as a parent, you could decide to show your kids Roots or Schindler's List, or one of the movies that is very graphic but shows real history. So if parents are watching this, hey, you can supplement us at home as well. So there's always that. And I think, hacks like that are what is necessary while we're
trying to sort out as a society, what is it that we think is actually needs to be common knowledge versus, individualized, or family sponsored knowledge. Yeah.
Right. So the next subject I want to talk about is differentiating and learning. So teaching to the test, so the teachers are trying to teach to the test. The students are motivated by the test. So the one student made the point, she said a lot of the class is learning how to answer the question. How does it look on the test? Instead of learning that subject. And I feel like teachers are stuck between a rock and a hard place because they have to teach these tests. And then in some states, they're even looked at or even paid based on how students do on these tests. So that's tough.
Yeah, no, I think, what's measured gets treasured, right? And that's where I think it would behoove, when I think about it from the side of being a parent, which means also you are an adult who is paying property taxes into your local and state school system, right? So property and state income taxes. That's where I start to go like, hey, there's a citizenship piece here that we should be involved in, because if we continue to vote with our feet by going to school districts that have the best test scores in aggregate, and if we continue to put the most emphasis on, well, you want to make sure you've got those AP classes and that you get those 4 and 5s on those AP tests, and that you like all these things that prioritize learning happening in a way that can readily be measured inside ETS instruments, right? Then that's what's going to be valued, right? Is the ability to represent and regurgitate knowledge in ways that match standardized testing scores. And if that's not what we think, if we don't think that that actually prepares people to effectively engage in the workplace or as citizens or even in college, then we need to behave differently, right? We need to value what's valuable and say, okay, if we think other things matter, then how might we measure whether or not a student is developing critical thinking, whether or not they're developing communication and collaboration skills, whether or not they're developing the ability to identify problems and then work together to solve those problems, whether or not they're developing the ability to connect with other humans and, collaborate together. When we continue to push the make sure you get those good grades on the, standardized tests, we're gonna judge a district based on that, and make sure that we judge the teachers based on that, and make sure that you get those high scores in the AP exam, all that kind of stuff, then that's what we're valuing is test taking skills. Right? We're valuing whether or not students are developing test taking skills, and we're valuing whether or not teachers are teaching test taking skills. Right.
Right.
And I think that, the particular story you're talking about is from a student who's taking an AP class. Where she took it because she was all excited because this was like a subject area she was really interested in. And then she was like, and she thought it was going to be intellectually challenging. And she's like, we spent a third of the time on AP test taking skills. And I think that's been the progression. That was not what the AP classes that were like when I was in high school a cajillion years ago, right? Like we spent very little time prepping for the test itself and way more time just invested in meaningful, interesting conversation. I loved my AP classes in high school. I loved them. But I think that level of pressure, well, it's not enough to just offer AP classes. You need to be having students consistently scoring 4s and 5s if they're taking your AP classes, in order for us to deem those AP classes are worthwhile. And therefore the teacher is obviously motivated to make sure that those students know how to get 4s and 5s on those AP tests, and teaching them the specific test taking skills that will allow them to succeed on the AP test. And the same thing happens with any other standardized test. It's not just AP, it's just the story that the student shared happened to come up in relation to that. So to me, that's a little bit less of a short term. There's no easy way around that other than just you can make choices whether or not the AP classes are worth it for you. For me, that's more of a system change thing that I would love for more people to engage in thinking about, is if we keep measuring the same things, we will keep getting the same results. That will be what is prioritized. Are we actually measuring what we care about as a society, right? Is that actually what's getting measured with all the standardized tests that we are putting so much money and time and effort into?
Right. And I was thinking when I was reading it too, she probably was the exception, because let's face it, most students take AP classes because they want it to look good for college. They just want to get a good grade. They don't actually care about the content,
Right.
And there's many classes where I just wanted a good grade. I didn't care about the content, when I was in school as well. So what can I say? So you talked about how many students find their career path outside of school, not knowing what they want to do. So one of your students, I'm going to find it in the book, but she wanted to be a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's a bad thing to find your career path outside of school. I think a lot of people do, but let's talk a little about that.
You're talking about both with the student in the book, with your daughter, right? It's exposure experiences. Most of us can't figure out what it is we want to do. The main profession we've been exposed to from kindergarten through 12th grade is teaching, right? So if you don't want to be a teacher and you don't want to be what one of your parents is, which is probably the only other meaningful exposure you've gotten to what a type of work actually looks and feels like, then you're just guessing, right? You're taking a shot in the dark, or you're doing whatever it is that somebody who has the most influence and who you trust the most is telling you they think you would like. And that doesn't tend to work out super well. I was just getting physical therapy the other week myself for, you're talking about sports medicine, right? So I was just getting, it was slightly related, but just getting physical therapy for an injury in my neck, and was talking while I was there with this lovely young man who's a senior in high school, because it was part of a standard operating procedure that the seniors in his high school went and did. I forget what they called it, a co-op or an internship, right? But as part of their senior year, they got to pick something that they thought was interesting and then go and basically sit in that place of work for several weeks full time. That was how they were wrapping up their class credit for the year, to actually see if they liked that kind of work, if it was interesting to them, right? And the high school had to do some extra work to coordinate and have different places that were willing to have students, come and be able to observe and intern in that way. But it's definitely possible. One of the interviewees in the book, same thing. We just had him, we'll have the podcast episode coming out July 10th talking about this more on our podcast, but got to have that experience of I'm interested in biology and maybe medicine, but I think animal, I don't know, maybe I want to be a marine biologist, maybe I want to be a vet, I don't know, went to a public vo-tech charter choice type school. I don't fully understand how it worked in the system that he's in, but it was a public school. He wasn't paying for it, but it was one where he had to apply to get in. And he got to do a co-op at a vet's office, right? And to really give him a feel of is this something I want to do? I would love if students got more opportunities like that. And I saw the difference that it made when I was a college professor and I had all the students, like I mentioned, who were writing's not going to be part of my career. One of my standard projects was, you're going to go shadow the job that you think you're interested in for a day and keep track of every form of writing they do. I don't care if it's note-taking, if it's a chart, if they're a note, right? Every type of writing they do. And then you're going to put together a paper about that, right? About what is the type of writing required in this profession? What type of preparation does it require? What are the ranges of different things? What did they, you need to interview them, find out there's other type of writing that you just didn't see that day. But students came back most in love with that project because they had the chance to actually, they had an excuse and a note from a professor telling them, you need to go observe this thing that you're interested in for just a day, right? And I remember I had one student who's I don't need to learn writing. I'm going to be a cop. And there's no writing. And I was cool. So they do ride-alongs. You do a ride-along for a day. You come back. And he came back and he was he had to write for 2 hours out of his 8-hour shift. Now, I don't think I want to be a cop anymore. That's too much writing. I was I don't know if that was the exact effect I was looking for, but at the very least, he got the chance to actually see what it was like instead of just his idea of what it was like. So that's my way too long answer, Kelly, as to I really would love and am looking for ways that I can have my kids do it informally. And there's some coordination with a technical school in the school district that I'm in, where they might be able to do it formally through the school system, but have the chance to actually get hands-on and get a feel for what different kinds of work are genuinely before you go and start getting yourself in debt in college, working towards a specific career, and then discover you don't want to do it, right? That's awful. And if you can't do it in high school, what I've already told my kids is I expect you to take a gap year where you are working. If you have not figured out things that you're interested in by the time you graduate from high school, cool. Don't go to college until you have figured that out. Don't start racking up debt. Don't do that. I have so many college students who incurred so much debt because they were just trying to figure it out. And they kept switching majors and switching majors and switching majors, right? It's just like, that's brutal. That's a really brutal way to be trying to figure out what it is that you want to do. So sorry, a little bit of a rant there.
No, you made so many good points. It's so funny because that is the opposite advice that most parents would give. Most parents are like,
Yeah.
I had one student at the private school, her mom told her, if you take a gap year, I won't pay for college. Because
Wow.
I think she said that her mom thought if she did that, then she wouldn't go at all. So
She wouldn't go back.
right.
I will admit that I'm biased because I took a gap semester in the middle of my undergraduate experience. Like, long story, but I came back appreciating college so much more because I had seen how incredibly boring the stuff was that I could do without a college degree. And I regretted that I had like I'd come into college like it was 13th grade. Like it was, just still in that like automated, I'm just doing what it is that the teachers want me to do. I'm not really thinking about this as a chance of like, now I can make meaningful choices. And I am like paying money to be here and I need to make the most of that, right? I was in default mode and didn't appreciate it. So I will admit that probably influences my thinking of like, looking back towards that. But it was something that a couple of the students that I talked with, especially as I followed up with students because after we made the draft of the book, we sent it back to all the interviewees to get their thoughts. And it's been interesting to me how many of them have said, now looking back, now that I'm in college, I really wish I'd taken a gap year. I really wish that I had taken some time to get a better feel for what really mattered to me, to bounce back after high school, to pause and assess. I just kind of, went with that path that was easiest in front of me. And I'm now not sure that I am doing the best things with that. Right.
Right. No, interesting points, because you're right. I did know some people would change their major and change their major again. So you're right. And I think I would encourage kids, some high schools offer classes, because that's finally how I got a maybe out of my own son, is because he took he took a sports medicine class, and my daughter took medical assistant, which she already knew she wanted to do something in the medical field, but they allowed her to shadow. It was really good. Hi, Rebecca. We're just talking about college, but none of my kids have asked, knock on wood, but I don't know how I would feel about a gap year, as I would be a little bit afraid that they wouldn't go back. But my sister had kind of a similar experience to what you're talking about. She didn't go right into college. She took a break for like 2 years. And I think she was finally like, okay, if I want to make a little more money, I need to go to college. But there's such a movement now for more trade schools and things like that. I think people are starting to see, if you just go to college, because like when I was that age, the advice was just get a college degree in anything. It doesn't matter. And that's not really the advice anymore, because now they're saying you're going to rack up debt. It better be something that can get you a good job.
Right.
So for example, if one of my kids said, I want to major in philosophy or theater, I'd be like, well, those are things you can study on your own. You can go be in a Broadway play if you want, but you don't need to go to college for that,
Right. Yeah. So, and I think the other thing that still tends to get overlooked, and I had my own stigmas and biases about too, is open access community colleges, right? Like I taught at one because that was where I was offered a job when I hit the job market as a professor. Not because I had a particular, but when I was there, I was so impressed with the colleagues that I had there and how dedicated they were to their teaching and to student learning. And it made sense once I paused thinking about it, because I was like, oh yeah, they don't have a publish or perish thing hanging over their head. They are not being judged based on how much research they produce that other academics like. They're being judged based on how well they do in the classroom with their students. That's what determines whether or not they keep this job. They're here focused on the teaching, right? And I'm not saying like every community college professor is great and every community college is amazing. There is variation there, just like there is with anything else. But I think we tend to skip it. And I was really impressed with one of the young women that I spoke with for the book, who talked, it was clear how strategic she was, right? She finished homeschool at 17 and she was like, I'm not going to go to college until I know what it is that I'm going to do it for. And then she waitressed for a while, essentially, and was like, got to know different people through working in the service industry, got a feel for different jobs. She's like, I want to be a lawyer. Let me be really strategic about this. Okay, if I get my 2 years degree from this community college, they have a scholarship agreement with this 4-year college that has a scholarship agreement with this law school. So if I go here, I can get my first 2 years of school done really cheaply. Then I can get a scholarship for the private, more prestigious school to do the next 2 years and have my bachelor's degree. And then I can get a scholarship for the next 2 years to get my law degree. And I will have paid less money overall to get the result that I want. And had gamed that out so thoughtfully. And I was like, I was not that thoughtful as an 18-year-old at all. Like how can we help more young people really own their choices and their future that way? Right.
Right. So my daughter's going to community college. Her boyfriend is just as you described. He has to pay his way through college. So he wants to do it with no debt. He's trying to find jobs that are higher paying so that he can pay his way through school without debt. He just got his realtor license, even though he wants to be a surgical nurse ultimately. And I'm just so impressed with how he has that knowledge at 18. Because ultimately, like you were saying, that prestigious school can still be on your resume that you graduated from there, and no one has to know that the first 2 years you went somewhere else and you paid a lot less money than this person with that same degree on their resume. So
you both end up with bachelors from the same prestigious school, but one of you paid significantly less money for it, right?
Right. And I find once you get into the job, maybe not when you're first out of college, but after you get into the job, nobody cares where you graduated from.
Nobody.
You're a nurse, you're a teacher. It doesn't matter. You have your degree. That's all we even care about.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about the last half of your book was all about technology in the classroom. That's a huge can of worms, I know. I have my own opinions, but I'll let you start with your first thoughts on that.
I was not originally planning on having technology be in the book, but because we were just, the standard question that we asked every student that we interviewed was, tell me about your most engaging experience learning and tell me about your least engaging experience learning. And then everything else was just follow-ups, right? So based on what it was that they described in the stories, we would dig, why did that happen? Tell us more about that, all that kind of thing. But it was the same 2 standard questions to start off every conversation. A number of the students ended up getting into technology. Now, part of that is because we were interviewing students, year and a half out from COVID lockdowns, thereabouts. So it's still top of mind for a lot of people. But it really struck me how thoughtful the students that brought it up on their own were being around this issue, and prompted me to then go do a bit more digging, and finding that the remarks that Dr. Prinstein from the APA, the chief scientist from the APA, had given to Congress was like, wow, we really do, between what young people themselves are bringing up and what increasingly sort of research is showing us about the effects of different kinds of technology on adolescent development, and the way that it's particularly intersecting with the way the brain is developing at that time period. We really need to be talking about this more, right? I mean, that's really my main take, was like, we need to be talking about this more. And then hearing from educators afterwards, as I was putting these things together, and I'm sure you have plenty of these stories yourself, of how many educators are like, I'm trying, and my students all have phones. Mm-hmm. How am I going to compete with that? You're not. Like, there's no way that a teacher can compete with a device that is meant to ensnare our attention. There's just, it's not possible. That's brutal. That was starting to be a thing while I was a professor. I would make jokes to my students as they would be saying, and I'd be like, listen, I just want y'all to know, I know when you're on your phones because nobody just looks at their lap and smiles. Okay. So it's obvious to me what's going on. If you thought you were getting away with something, you're not, but it's even more so now. I cannot imagine how hard this is for teachers at this point.
Right. So I have several thoughts on that, both different sides. So on one hand, technology has made things easier, because when I was teaching at the middle school, I had 160 students. So if they could use their Chromebooks, do an assignment online and turn it in, that made my job so much easier, because trying to grade all these papers, I don't even know how teachers did it in the age where all they had was paper, especially middle and high school where you have over 100 students. So it made things easier. But on the other hand, all of them were using their Chromebooks to do other things besides what you were doing in class. I would
Yeah.
use Nearpod, or, I had them doing assignments, but they would have another tab going. And at one point, our tech person tried to block this site and this app and that app. But every time she would do it, they would find a way around it. Yeah. And there was so many blockages. I guess so many teachers kept saying, can you block this? Can you block that? She finally sent out an email to everybody, like, if they're not doing what they're supposed to in class, just they should get in trouble. Basically she's saying, I can't really do anything,
Yeah.
It's beyond me. Hi, Cindy. Cindy had, she homeschooled. She teaches at a private school now. I think, are you teaching middle or high school, or both? I can't remember. Anyways, so you'll have to go back and watch this later, Cindy, because she has a lot of adult children now, but you have one who's a junior as well. So this is all about high school and college age. So it's just a constant battle. And even though they weren't allowed to have the phone in the class, they would always sneak it. They'd always, they'd have it underneath. At the private school I worked at, they were supposed to keep their phone like locked away. They didn't have lockers, but they had a place where they put all the belongings. They were supposed to keep their phones there. I'm teaching 7th through 10th. Okay, this is perfect. This is all students. I have 11th and 12th graders she's talking about for her own kids. Okay, perfect. You'll have to go back and watch from the beginning. So it was so hard. But I have to say, again, on the other side, I have two sides. There have been times where my own son's school has had lockdowns, and him having his phone, him being able to text me and be like, I'm okay, has given me a lot of peace. So so I told them at the private school, you can have your phone with you, because I know, like, if there was an emergency, it would help your own mother to be able to hear from you. But it needs to stay in your bag. And if I ever see it come out, then you're in trouble. And I, coming from first teaching online, I would use technology in the classroom. Like, I'd use Nearpod, which they would need to use their computers. But again, they take advantage of it. They have something else going in another tab. And sorry, I was online with a tech person for my tutoring business website. Well, that's okay. Thanks for being here now. There's a lot to talk about in this book. We've been talking about it for over an hour. Yes. But yeah, I guess technology, there's good and bad, but like you said, it's a losing battle. The kids are just on their phones, and I hear there's some school systems who are banning phones, and hope that my school system does it, because like you said, it's just a losing battle for the teachers. We cannot compete with the phone.
Yeah, you can't. Teaching is hard enough as it is. Trying to make something that people did not opt into interesting and engaging for them. And if they have right available in front of them on their Chromebook, on their laptop, on their school-sponsored iPad, or on their phone that they brought in with them, the opportunity to instead pay attention to something else, they're going to, the same thing that you're describing, happening with like the person probably like, I cannot block any more sites. This happens at my son's middle school, right? And he's still, as of now, knock on wood, hopefully stays this way, pretty honest with me, because I try to not tell him all of my opinions about some of the things that he's telling me, so that he doesn't go, she's freaking out, I'm not going to tell her anymore. But every week it was a different, like, oh, well, they had blocked and shut down the such and such site where we were playing video games, but then so-and-so found this other site that they haven't found and blocked yet. And so now that's what we're playing this week. Right. Exactly. And I'm just like, every week. Yeah. You can't, one or two tech people cannot compete with hundreds of motivated pre-adolescents or adolescents who are bored and looking for something else to distract them. Right. Like that like game of whack-a-mole is, it's not fair to the teachers. It's not fair to the students. It's not fair. Like, it's just across the board. Not going to work. And then when you think about some of the, like, so you've got that immediate classroom distraction. Then when you think about some of the other pieces that some of the students were referencing in the interviews of the like long-term psychological, emotional, relational things that are caused by the use of social media in and around the classroom. I mean, I've talked with a number of parents subsequent to putting the book together, who said, listen, I would like to limit my child, like not have my child have a smartphone or have these various apps. But there's school sponsored activities that are relying, like, one parent who's saying like, my kid loves volleyball. It's his main way of engaging and staying connected. It's what causes him to feel motivated to go to school because it's the school volleyball team. And the school volleyball team requires that he go on Instagram and like and interact with the posts from the school volleyball team a certain number of times each week. It is an expectation as part of being part of that club. And that's the same with all the other clubs that he's involved in. They all have social media accounts and they're supposed to be on them and using them. And if you don't, then you can't be like a club member, and I was like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? We're making it really hard. We're sending such mixed messages, right? Like we've so I will go on.
It's hard. I would say I tried to limit until COVID. I gave up. My kids are older, but yeah. Cindy said, I'm also on the school board and public school is ridiculous trying to keep up tech and kids. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
yeah.
That's a good point too. She talking about being on the school board. We were talking a little earlier about advocacy. She's doing what she's telling everybody else to do. If you don't like the way things are in your public school, get involved in the school board. Anybody can get involved. They don't have enough people involved.
Exactly.
They are trying to figure out how to handle phones at school. Our students don't use laptops. We use old-fashioned teaching. Yes, but here's a counter argument. I know you teach at a private school, which is usually a lot less students. So the thing was, when I worked in the middle school with 160 students, like doing the online assignments made grading so much easier. That's the thing too. Yeah. I had a horrible time before I went to teaching in school. My own kids were abusing phones at home. She was homeschooling. Oh, wow. So even at homeschooling, where they're with you all the time, you had trouble just keeping that a wraps. That's interesting. Okay. Yes. Well, I think we've talked about it all. Here, let me share. We've been talking for a while.
We went through the whole whole thing. Thank you for all your thoughtful questions.
No problem. So here's the book. Can you help me give a bleep? Unlocking teen motivation in school and life. And then also you have a podcast. I'm going to share that as well. It's on Apple Podcasts. So
you can find it everywhere. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, all the places. Yeah.
So I'm guessing this just goes in a lot more detail every week, talking about things that have to do with the book.
Each week we take a question that someone, an educator or a parent, has asked us in relation to something that came up in the book. So it's not the same content as the book. It's sort of building on, adding additional perspective as people basically initially as advanced readers got hold of it and they were like, okay, but how about this thing? Or as I'd talk with parents, they'd be like, so what about this one? So you're saying the importance of student voice. What does that really look like, right? What does that really mean to have authentic student voice? Can you tell me more about that? And initially people were like, oh, you should do another book. I was like, I'm not writing another book. Okay, we're going to do a podcast. We're just going to take one question at a time as we go forward, because I'm just not ready to write another book at this point.
Right. So I just finished, I read your book. Now I want to read your podcast because I have a high schooler and a college student, and I have taught in the past. Let's see what Cindy is saying. I agree. Easier for teachers. I love the online grading. Who knows what tech will be like in 10 years when my oldest is a senior, or even 5 years from now, right? Yeah. It's always changing. Even 5 or 10 years ago, there's things we didn't know.
Oh yeah. All my friends that are still writing professors, they're like, I mean, at this point, I feel like what I'm doing is grading their ChatGPT prompting skills rather than grading their writing, right? Like, because I know that the stuff that they're turning in has been generated by AI. And what good is that doing them? Right? What am I even doing when I'm grading? Why? So, oh, really? I didn't even think about that piece of it, Cindy.
Right. Library. Yeah, the library is crazy. I bet. The library trustee. Okay. Well, this has been an interesting conversation for sure. I recommend her book, which it comes out July 9th. So you can pre-order it. It looks like you can get it on Amazon and a whole bunch of different places. I think I saw it on eBay and a lot of places. July 9th. So very soon. Thanks for coming on today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, if any of you all think of questions that you want me to tackle on the podcast, feel free to submit it through the canyouhelpmegive.com. There's a submission form to put in your questions to go into a future podcast topic. And Kelly, maybe you can come on and tackle one of them. So
yes, I'd love to. I'd love to. So, all right. Bye, everyone. Thanks for those of you who came live and for those who will watch later. Bye.
All right. Bye.